Hey, everybody. Hello, humans. Hi, Clark. I see you're already on. Everybody else, let me hear from you. That you're out there listening, and let me know where you are in the world and where you're tuned in from. I know, or maybe even like what channel you're tuned in from. That's always fun to see. I see Clark, you're in from LinkedIn. It shows right in your little icon there, so that's cool. Um, we're gonna be rocking and rolling in just a few minutes. If you have been tuned in before, you already know this is the Tech Humanist Show, of course. It is a multimedia format program, so we're doing this live across YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and even Twitch, although nobody watches it on Twitch. It's just to like check all the boxes. And then we're talking about how data and technology shape the human experience with a guest each week. And then it becomes an audio format. So it goes to podcast and it becomes available on iOS and Google and Stitcher and all that good stuff. So please subscribe or follow along wherever you're watching from, wherever you're listening from, and you won't miss any new episodes. So looks like we are live and rolling. So I'm going to go ahead and bring in our guest. We got I see some numbers starting to pick up. I want to make sure I don't run too soon if people are still tuning in. But we'll go ahead. All right, Marco. All the platforms. Yeah, sorry, Twitch. Twitch, I mean, maybe I'm just not hip enough for Twitch. That's more the issue. That's really what's going on there. But we got it out there anyway. So, if you're a diehard Twitch user or viewer, you're more than welcome to view the show there. All right, let's get to our guest. We are talking with Kaitlin Ugolik Phillips, the author of The Future of Feeling, Building Empathy in a Tech-Obsessed World. She is a journalist and editor whose writing on law, finance, health, and technology has appeared in The Establishment, Vice, Quartz, Institutional Investor Magazine, Law 360, Columbia Journalism Review, Lithub, Scientific American, New York Post, Vice, Salon, and Narratively, among others. So that's just a sampling. There's even more. Just insert name of publication here. She is probably published in it. Kaitlin writes a blog and newsletter about empathy featuring reportage, essays, and interviews. So start getting your questions ready for our guest. And Kaitlin, you are live on the Tech Humanist Show. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
Yeah, me too. This seems like it's been kind of an inevitable conversation between us. I've been looking forward to it very much. So I'll just jump right in and ask you, how did you first get on researching and writing about how tech is changing the future of human empathy?
Well, it really came from just the concern about that question. I, as an old millennial, I'm 32, so I kind of grew up online. First with AOL Instant Messenger and LiveJournal, and then MySpace, and I really miss MySpace. But on and on to where we are now. And a few years ago, 2014, 2015, I just was kind of having a lot of really negative experiences, friends and strangers on social media, and just kind of trying to think more broadly about this is where we've gotten just in the past 10 years. How are things going to change as technology continues to change? I was some tech finance stuff at the time at Institutional Investor, and I was just realizing, okay, all this investment is happening in the Internet of Things and in virtual reality and all these other new emerging technologies. And I was just worried, what is going to happen to our ability to communicate with one another? And it was really a situation where I tried to find a book that focused on solutions or, the concerns about that. And I didn't find one at the time. So I had to write it.
Now it's your job. You identify a gap, now you got to write it. Well, it's such an important book. It covers such an interesting topic, and we'll dig in a lot of different ways. But I actually want to do a little quick side note and just ask, how tech affects human life and human just experience in general, this pandemic has certainly changed human life and human experience, and tech has been a part of that. So I'm curious what your life during the pandemic has looked like. Have you taken up any new hobbies, developed any new skills, sort of picked up any new wide-ranging research projects that you'll eventually publish?
Well, I haven't been that productive, but I will say that the book came out in February, like a month before everyone started going into lockdown, and I definitely did not imagine that some of the kind of dystopian seeming situations described in the book would become reality so quickly, and kind of do this big social experiment right away on, what does it mean to be plugged in constantly all the time and have to communicate that way. I have been trying to actually not spend as much time with technology because, all of my workday is on the computer, except that I have taken up Animal Crossing on the Nintendo Switch.
Animal Crossing. Everybody's crazy about Animal Crossing.
I know. It's perfect. Like, I'm not a big gamer, but so it's perfect for me because it's just mindless tasks, cute. And, I have started doing some research for a potential new project, but that's actually about something totally different. People keep asking me, oh, you should write a follow-up to your book about, and I'm like, I don't think I need to write a book. I think everybody knows what's happening now, Well,
and also your book just came out. I know that's inevitable, though. I mean, everybody who writes a book knows that, as soon as the book is handed over and done, you're on to the next idea. Like, you already are thinking about it.
I don't think people realize that how long that process takes. Yeah. So maybe in 2023 we'll see something new.
Will it be about Animal Crossing, do you think?
Probably not, unfortunately. Okay. I'll keep that for myself.
Well, I loved the book. I loved a lot that happened in it, what you covered, and I loved the people that you introduced us to. There was one in particular, Dylan Marin or Marone, I don't know how you pronounce his last name, but I wasn't aware of his work, but what you described about conversations with people who hate me and unboxing every single word and sitting in bathrooms with trans people, they're all brilliant concepts. I did end up watching a few episodes of the Every Single Word because they're only like 11 seconds long, which just for the audience, in case you haven't run across these, if you look, go to YouTube and look up Dylan, Marron, Every Single Word, and it's what he's done is splice together or just edit down feature films to just those lines that were spoken by actors of color. And it's sobering, and I mean, I'm sure that many people of color were already aware of this phenomenon, and white people may have been aware of it too, but it's such a striking illustration. So I think the one I looked at was Moonrise Kingdom, and it was 11 seconds long. So, it really gets the point across. But anyway, he's just a brilliant creator, and I loved how you wove in what he's doing with how, especially with conversations with people who hate me, with how people are interacting online. So have you found any other cool people since you've published and that you are like, oh, I wish I could have included them?
I'm so glad you asked that question because yes, and I think that happens so often, but authors don't really get to say that. But first, Dylan is great. I got to meet him in person, and his podcast, I think it's still ongoing, is really an exercise in empathy. I highly recommend listening to it. But to answer your question, so I recently interviewed Dr. Matthew at the University of Northern Colorado, and he does a lot of research on gaming in education, so specifically for social emotional learning for younger kids and the use of games in schools. And he and I had a conversation about like ed and virtual schooling, but he just had so many fascinating things to say about how kids learn social emotional skills through technology, and we talked a little bit about VR, and afterwards I was like, well, either you should have written my book, or I wish I had talked to you 4 years ago.
Yeah, that hits on at least 3 or 4 topics, right?
Yeah, and then I also, the organization Color of Change, I didn't come across them until relatively recently, but it's an online civil rights organization, and they deal with a lot of these kinds of things from like the policy arena of, not just empathy, but civil rights on the internet, and it would have been great to include them. And honestly, you.
Oh.
I came across your work a little bit too late as well, and you would have been a great person to include.
Well,
too.
we're connected now, and we're doing
Yeah.
this. So yeah, that's wonderful. No, those are brilliant examples too. Although, at least on my end, the audio cut out when you gave the name of the first researcher. Can you just say his or her name again?
Yeah, it's Dr. Matthew Farber. He's at the University of Northern Colorado.
Great. Yeah, I'm sure that there were listeners who were like, "Oh, I didn't catch that name." What I think was so interesting for me about your book is empathy is this concept that I think people talk about a lot, and then they do it in this very abstract, broad, intellectually undisciplined way.
Mm.
But what you've done with the book is really unpack it and go into different aspects with intellectual rigor. And so even at one point, you quoted an essayist named Leslie Jamison, who was writing about medical empathy, and she wrote what I think may have been the most beautiful thing I've ever read about empathy, and it was this: empathy isn't just listening, it's asking the questions whose answers need to be listened. Empathy requires inquiry as much as imagination. Empathy requires knowing you know nothing. Empathy means acknowledging a horizon of context that extends perpetually beyond what you can see. And so to me, that was just like, it seems like she's really isolated these elements that make empathy such a special concept. Like, it's imaginative, it's active, it's curious, and it's dimensional. So do you find that you collect definitions of empathy as part of what you're doing here? Do you have a favorite?
Yeah, that definitely wasn't something I expected, but that has definitely happened. And yeah, thank you for reading that bit, because that's from Empathy Exams. It's our collection of essays, and it gives me chills because that was actually the book that I picked up thinking I might find what I was looking for, and it was something totally different, but so beautifully written. And I think one of the most important parts is when she says, the perpetual, I don't remember the exact phrasing, but that your inability, sort of knowing what you don't know, and you may not ever know, but it's kind of like what's in that gap there that you are still making an effort to show emotion and show that you care. Yeah. And I think that's a really important piece that often gets missed when empathy becomes a buzzword, especially in the tech community and in the business community, especially in business, where you have all of the, empathy, the empathy index and all of these, it's just used as to actually just mean, we kind of care about our employees, or, right. we have a great HR department. But in terms of a favorite definition, I liked thinking, and this is actually from, I think, some Buddhist writing. I can't remember exactly where it came from, but that sympathy is feeling for someone and empathy is feeling with someone. It's this simple, and further to say, even just making the effort to feel with someone, acknowledging that you might not literally know what it's like to experience what they're experiencing. I think that's kind of like an active form of empathy.
Yeah, that's a really great distillation phrase, because I think that's what a lot of it comes down to is you can work around the nuance and the abstraction, and I love nuance and abstraction. I'll work around nuance and abstraction all day. But when you're actually trying to deliver something that's applicable for people, that people can actually take and understand in real useful ways, it requires that level of intellectual rigor. And I find this too, a lot of my work centers around meaning. And meaning is similarly like a concept that people talk about in very abstract terms. And so a lot of the work I've done over the last few decades is to develop like concepts and clear constructs that people can apply, and how they can break down what we're really talking about when we talk about meaning, and specifically meaningful experiences. So was that part of in any way what drew you to the topic, that it lacked that intellectual rigor? I mean, you mentioned going to the one book and being disappointed and kind of feeling like, now I need to create this.
Yeah, I think that might have been part of it. I mean, I think what I at the beginning thought was missing was a future looking piece of intellectualism, I guess, that specifically focused on that tech and human interconnection. But as I went on with my reporting, I really started to think more about the danger of having a word that can kind of be used in different ways. I know that a lot of the things that I wrote about, and I tried to be clear that there were pros and cons and that there were criticisms of different things, especially like when it comes to virtual reality experiences that are meant to build empathy. It's so easy to say, okay, this is an empathy building experience, put on the headset, pretend to be someone else, just end it there. And now this person walks away with this idea that they know what it's like to have a disability or to live in a different skin color. And I think that's kind of why I was looking to really lay out, talking about when I'm talking about empathy, so that it's clear that I don't subscribe to those things.
Yeah, that was a really compelling section of the book when you wrote about virtual reality, augmented reality, mixed reality, like all of the kinds of mixed reality options, and what was happening with different experiments that people were trying. There's this concept that virtual reality is the empathy machine, as Chris Milk called it, right?
Right.
And then I think there's a lot of sort of default acceptance of that. And I love how well you unpacked it. So walk us through some of what you found when you started to examine what was happening in some of the research that was actually out there.
Well, one interesting thing is that there's not a ton. Like, a lot of what I wrote about is so ongoing. So it was kind of difficult to try and, I couldn't really prove much, but I could talk about my experiences and a lot of other people's and the little bit of research. The most eye-opening experience and interview was with Dr. Courtney Cogburn, and she, I believe, is at Columbia, and she helped create this experience called 1000 Cut Journey, and it's an embodied virtual experience. So you put on a headset and also hold these controllers, and you move around us, and you kind of go through different stages of life of this young Black man when he's a kid, when he's a little bit older, when he's an adult, and it's animated, and you're kind of embodied, so you can sort of look down, and your arms are the color of his arms, and you're being spoken to as if you're him. And what I wrote about, like, I went into that experience excited but also skeptical for the reasons I just explained. And when I came out of it, I really felt like I felt like more than anything, it highlighted to me just how little I actually know about what it's like to be this particular type of other person. So it wasn't that, oh, now I could just put this in my, white ally backpack and say that I've, had this experience, but that it emphasized to me how different my experience was, which I think triggered maybe a more useful kind of empathy that was like, okay, let me learn a little more, or kind of keep going. But I think some research that I read also emphasized that that's not going to be everyone's experience, in part because the experience and sort of behaviors and personality that you have going into these experiences has a huge impact on how you feel going out. So like any other tool, and I say this over and over in the book, like, these things could be used to help us build empathy, but also to potentially be manipulative or, cause other problems.
Right. I mean, that's one of the recurring themes in my work, is that there's a lot of good to be harnessed here, and there's also a lot of bad and destructive power. And so I think we have to be very eyes wide open about both of those things, about recognizing what the harms are and what could possibly go wrong in order to build the best futures and create the best possible outcomes with tech, and I think kind of in general with anything, right?
Yeah.
But I thought it was very interesting that your example of the one scenario that seemed like it did offer some dimensional empathy or some recontextualizing of empathy was Kathy Hackle, who's a friend of mine, and she may be watching the show. So Kathy had talked about losing her feeling of empathy from having been subjected to horrendous video footage at CNN, I think it was, and then having that sort of reactivated by a virtual reality experience or a 360 degree sort of video experience. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think she told me she felt kind of desensitized. Totally makes sense, because if your job is to watch sort of screen horrific images to see what's acceptable to put on TV, how do you do that for more than a few minutes without turning something off? But yeah, she said she used the metaphor of like a switch flipping when she, I guess she had moved on from that position and then experienced this 360 video. I think it was one about solitary confinement, and
right.
having, I don't know, it just kind of was like, oh, okay, like that muscle is still there. And actually that's how I like to think about empathy, is that it's a kind of a muscle that if we let it atrophy, which tech can unfortunately help us do, it becomes more of an issue. But if we practice it more regularly, we can, have better communication and relationships.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important concept and important discussion. I'd like to just set that aside for just a moment, because I think I definitely want to get there and talk about how can people develop better empathy and use those skills and all of that. But I wanted to stay just for a second with this mixed reality discussion, because you also touched on a point just a moment ago about how some of these experiences, like the One Cut Journey, where you are inhabiting this fictitious black young man character. And I think you made a really interesting point, and you had other experts who were you quoted as making the point that this is a really kind of tenuous process. Like you're experimenting in ways, or these experiments are being done in ways that you hope is going to create more empathy, but there is this risk of, number one, of exposing someone to an experience that they then think they understand fully and they can be sort of dismissive of now. And that, of course, is a huge risk. But also the other thing that was pointed out, I think I have it in my notes here, Kang wrote in Slang that the very concept of empathy creation through VR is an othering process. That that was such a brilliant observation. So yeah, so it felt like you really got into some great critique of that notion of VR as an empathy machine. And what did you feel like you walked away with is sort of the takeaway, the summary, and the recommendation for people?
Yeah, it was definitely a journey while reporting the book, because I did start with this idea that I'm looking for solutions, I'm looking for positive, future-looking things, and then having to realize as I came across these different other perspectives that, not that I thought everything was going to be puppies and roses, but that, there are real, important, significant caveats. And really, I just kind of came away with like more of an ambivalence about, what is possible, and at least currently. And I guess the final chapter of the book ends up being a little bit of a soapbox, which anyone who reads it will see, about why I think tech companies need to take all of these things into more consideration. But I just think that I still think that exposing yourself to as many other perspectives as possible is always a good thing, whoever you are. But that piece, again, that we talked about at the beginning, that part of empathy is knowing what you don't know. And I think right now in the world and politics and culture and science, we're all trying to get comfortable with cognitive dissonance and with not knowing things and with having conversations about things that we don't have the answers about. And I think social media in particular really encourages you to just be concrete and to, say, this is what I believe, and stand by it in a debate, even if really, you're more ambivalent or and I think getting more comfortable with not knowing is really at the core of all of this. And I think that that othering piece is something I think about a lot and I worry about a lot, and I don't know exactly how to remedy, and maybe we don't, but I'm glad to be thinking about that and being able to say, I don't know, and let me try to imagine more what that feels like.
Yeah, and it seems like an important caveat or caution to be able to offer to anyone who's trying to create virtual experiences with the aim of increasing an empathetic response in people, that there are those considerations too, that there need to be sort of that holistic way of thinking about it, that this could have the opposite effect of what you're intending, and it could also create a sense of outsidership in the people that you're trying to build allyship for.
And one way to address that is just to include different kinds of people.
Yes.
That's kind of part of the soapbox I ended up on at the end of the book, is like more women, more people of color, people with disabilities, people who, are descendants of Native Americans, or just people who aren't just all the same kind of Silicon Valley guy that, and I say guy for a reason, that, not to say that every problem we're currently having with, social media, for example, can be traced exactly to identity issues. But hello, if you don't involve people and at the beginning of the process, it should not be surprising when these things come up years later or weeks later that, I didn't think about that. That's not an excuse anymore in 2020.
Yeah, no, and it's such a brilliant point. I actually want to pivot there to talking about the social media interactions in general, but just a little side note from one of our viewers, Christopher Dans, told us that it was an excellent topic, and also was curious about the chemical compound on your necklace. Is there relevant?
Oh, this is serotonin, or at least that's how it was advertised. And I'm an anxious gal, and when I have to do an interview, I like to have my extra serotonin armor.
Oh, I love that so much. What a great reveal. Thank you, Christopher, for asking that question. Christopher had also commented when we were talking about Kathy Hackle and her story, no one should have to shoulder the ugliness of an entire species. And so true. Thank you for sharing that. So, and Christopher just follows up and says, thought so, you rock. But let's go back to, so online interactions are kind of a funny topic, because I think it's kind of funny that you and I met originally through Twitter. In fact, I think almost everyone I've had as guests on this show I've met originally through Twitter. So, there is this possibility of having real connection and making really meaningful relationships with people, but there's certainly no saying that Twitter and other social platforms are hotbeds of what we might call antisocial activity as well. So you really delved into this in a lot of ways. It felt like you're talking about all of the the one topic was Dylan's show, Conversations with People Who Hate Me, and how he was able to confront people who had been, toxic commenters and trolls with him. That seemed like it made an impression on you in the way you wrote about it.
I just was baffled by the level of empathy that Dylan was able to have for these people. And I don't even know if that's what he would have called it, at the beginning. But listening to that show, it's so easy to stop seeing people as people. There's even some research I think I cite in the book about how when people disagree with us, we tend to see them as less human, not just online, but in general. And if I saw someone saying nasty things to me, swearing at me, calling me names, my gut instinct is not, and actually this is changing a little bit because I think about this so much, but my gut instinct normally would not be, what's this person going through? Like, what's their life like? Why is this what they feel like they need to be doing? It would be, things I'm not going to say out loud right now. But his ability to, first of all, convince people to have these offline conversations and record them, but then to just quietly sit and just listen to them talk. And, I think it doesn't always work out exactly how you would hope, but in a lot of cases, these people end up admitting, oh, I forgot you were a human. Mm-hmm. I didn't think you would read it. Or this is how I relieve stress because my life is difficult and I don't feel like I have other ways of relieving stress. And, I try to make the point in the book too that empathizing with someone isn't endorsing them, and I think that's actually might be the name of Dylan's new book that he's writing or has written.
Oh, nice.
Empathy is not endorsement, but that, you know, it takes effort and it takes working that muscle to say, I can empathize with the fact that this person is stressed, they've experienced a lot of hardship, this is how they take it out on people, and without thinking that's okay.
Right.
You know, like, it's really about boundary setting, I think, and about moving away from the way that social media makes conversations into games. So I just think that his work has really kind of like given you a great example of what it actually could look like if we had more empathy in conversations about really difficult things.
Yeah, and especially, so, you know, you talked about, and it's an obvious place to go in politics and disagreement, and certainly we're going through in the U.S., you know, this big presidential election cycle.
Feels like we always are.
I know, it does. It doesn't ever stop anymore. From the moment there's an election, it's like the beginning of the next campaign. And I feel that even for viewers who aren't in the U.S., you must feel subjected to this too. It feels like it completely overruns international news coverage. So I think one of the things that's interesting about that to me is that there is this duality that I've written before about how where we live online, and you know, we're increasingly our digital selves are our aspirational selves, and that because they contain data representations of the things we love and like and admire, and the data relationships to the people we love and like and admire. And so in one sense, it's like we're wearing our hearts on our sleeves more, but of course, we're simultaneously more vulnerable to, as Bill Vincent says in comments, this may have been discussed, but unfortunately, too many online want their anonymity to be bad or to act badly. And what I think, so it's this simultaneous vulnerability to this proliferation of anonymous trolls and bots and harassment and other bad behavior. So what's the approach there? How do we best, you know, use that, the empathy that we want to have, that's a human-centric skill, and navigate this complex dualistic world? What's our best bet there?
Oh man, I wish I knew what the best bet. I mean, honestly, my mind actually first, this doesn't really answer the question, but my mind first goes to having better tech, like including more things about communicating with people via social media in social emotional learning for kids. So, and just focusing more on empathy, on that muscle for young people. But that aside, I think that for me, so Instagram is my like horrible boogeyman. Like that's where I see this happen the most, is that duality. And I love the way you put that, because that really is where we are, is that you both are trying to be your aspirational self on Instagram. You know, you're posting the highlights, or you're posting that you're having a bad day, but in a way that you think will get the most attention. But then at the same time, you will see, you know, all these anonymous users who make accounts to troll people. I'm currently fascinated and horrified by this trend of influencers who are really into the QAnon stuff and are talking, like they're using their platforms, which are branded. They have these branded partnerships to talk about all of these things. And but anyway, that part of Instagram also exists, where a lot of anonymous arguments and trolling happening within there. I don't know that I think the problem is that we're all asked, and at this point it just seems natural to all go into the same place and talk about the same things in the same way, but we actually all have very different needs. And I wrote about this a little bit in an article about the mental health culture on places like Instagram and Pinterest, where you have these pretty images that have nice sayings and sort of the commodification of like anxiety and depression, and it's cool to be not okay, but like then you're comparing your not okayness to other people's. And that connects to this, because I think being more in touch with what our boundaries actually are and what we're actually comfortable and capable of talking about and how, I think that actually is a place to start for empathy for others. Because a lot of times when I've found myself in these kind of quagmire conversations, which I don't do so much anymore, but definitely have in the past, I realized like it was about that I was anxious about something, or I was angry, or I'm really being triggered by what this person is saying. That's about me. When I mean, that's a pretty common thing in psychology and just in general, that when someone is trolling you or being a bully, it's usually about them. And I think if we get better at sort of empathizing with ourselves or just setting better boundaries, we're going to wade into these situations less. I mean, that's a big ask, I know, for for millennials, Gen Z, Gen X, and anyone trying to survive right now on the internet.
But you gave some very helpful, useful guidelines. So I want to talk about one of the studies that you did write about that is talking about moderating social spaces and comment sections in news and so on. But the guidelines that this study present actually seem like they're a pretty interesting sort of framework for us all to think about how we approach interactions online. So I'm sure you know the study I'm referencing, where there's the staging, or sorry, the three basic conversational rhetorical moves. Mm-hmm. So I have them here in my notes, so you don't have to reference it. It was staging, evoking, and inviting. Do you remember enough to, off the top of your head, to be able to talk through those for us?
So that was fascinating to me, and I can't remember, but I think that was a Google API thing where they were kind of keeping track of what was happening in these comment threads. And so, right, there are those three different basic rhetorical moves in a conversation. And what I found when I tested it, because you could put chunks of text into this little bot, and it would kind of show you all the different rhetorical moves that were happening. I had I don't even remember what the conversation was about, but kind of an argument with a group of people, and I put a part of our conversation into this bot, and it showed that we just all kept staging. We were all in the state. It just never really went past staging. It just kept being like, this is my argument. Well, this is my argument. Okay, but this was my just cyclical.
So staging is you're just saying, hey, look, this is the conversation I'm trying to have, right?
Right. Okay. Setting up your view, setting up your expectation or your point. And to see that like in a graph, was like, oh, okay. It's like a little bit shameful that, wow, that felt so urgent and necessary for me to do that. And I'm sure the other people felt the same way, but we were not having a conversation.
It was not productive and an exchange, right? So those later two stages seem like they're key to having that more of an exchange, right? So the evoking, so pointing out relationships between the
so kind of if you and unfortunately, people kind of do weaponize this on Facebook, where it's really easy to tag people, and Twitter, but calling out someone's name and like specifically addressing them or asking them a question, that's not a yes or no question, and that's not a leading question, or identifying common ground. I think that's kind of more evoking. And then what was the third one?
The third one, inviting. So directly soliciting participation by asking a question or requesting a comment.
Okay, right. So yeah, evoking, I think, is more common ground piece, and inviting is direct questions. But yeah, I think in an ideal world, if we could all learn to have better conversations like that, but I just think the way that these platforms are built, it just is not, it's not intuitive to talk that way. It's so gamified. So how many notifications can we get? How many, how long can we make this go on? Or how can I win this conversation? But going forward, I try not to stage as much.
Yeah, that's a really great reminder. So as a quick reminder for the listeners, it was staging, evoking, and inviting. And we all spend way too much time in that staging saying, this is how I want to have this conversation. This is my argument. But if we move toward, spending more time in the evoking, the relationship between the participants, and the inviting, sort of in asking for feedback and asking for participation, that could be more helpful and healthy.
And I think what that highlights too is that it's really hard to have like an argument with someone or a debate or a disagreement with someone you don't trust and who doesn't trust you. And so I think that's the main reason, and a lot of other people have written about this, but I think that's the main reason a lot of conversations online don't go well, because you have no reason to think that person, to give them the benefit of the doubt. You don't know what you have in common. You don't know anything about their experience. And so it's really better, obviously, to have these kind of conversations with people that you do know, but we're in this weird backward situation where a lot of us are afraid to talk to our family and friends about difficult things, but it's really easy to fight with someone on Instagram, about the same thing.
Yeah, so we have a question here from Andy Polaine, and I think you just answered my question, but I'm going to throw it up on the broadcast anyway. So he says, the performative aspect of social media definitely leads to some toxic situations, either performative trolling or performative fake lifestyle. But the flip side of the promise of social media or the internet is that you can find people like you with your niche interests, etc., which is also a comfort. So what's your view on this? And it does seem like you sort of spoke to that, but anything to add there?
Yeah, I want to say that, like you said earlier, there are so many opportunities for connection, and I have made so many real friends and learned so many fascinating things. And I do love the ability to connect with people who have similar interests, but maybe have them in a slightly different way, or, they're a very different person, but we connect on this one thing. But one thing I've noticed is that so groups are ways to kind of focus on that part of media, but there have been several big Facebook groups that I've been a part of that the bigger they get and the longer they go on, the more they move away from the thing that we all have in common and become these just as bad as the rest of social media. So I think
when did this knitting group become this fascist group all of a sudden, right?
But that actually also brings up so the influencer thing I was talking about. There's a lot of people who create communities and then they can make them something else all of a sudden, and it's just about making money or followers, which then makes you money. But the people who are following don't know that. They think it's real to a certain extent because we're human and, we believe what we see. But I think that groups, I still have faith in groups. I still think that there's got to be some way that we can have maybe a new platform or change one of these platforms to where, there can be smaller groups with maybe moderating that is more humanist, human focused, empathy focused, that, makes them usable. Honestly, Reddit is a better me these days than any other platform. And I think part of that is because they've really taken a hard line recently. I know it took a lot to get there, but they've taken a hard line recently on the really bad stuff and just said, we don't care. It's just not going to be here anymore. And it's in their moderation teams on the different subreddits, really stick to their guns and put a lot of effort into it. And I think that's really what it takes to focus on that community building part and not get bogged down in the rest of it.
Yeah, I like that statement that I still have faith in groups. That's a good takeaway. I also have a question here from Christopher Downs saying, I found success in providing a reflection of what is being communicated with the person they say they want to be. Did you come across anything in your research regarding this approach? And it seems like you did actually talk about that a little bit. Do you have a...
So is that sort of like the idea of if someone disagrees with you, you kind of restate what you think they're saying to make sure you're on the same page?
Yeah, you can,
That would
Christopher,
work out.
are welcome to clarify yourself, but it seems to me that it's partly that, and partly, kind of trying to see the person who's
Mm.
communicating, which I think you wrote well about. One of the things seemed to be, getting offline as soon
Yeah.
as possible, right?
Well, I think that it so depends, but if you've had a lot of internet conversations, you can probably tell at this point, like, when you're talking to someone who wants to have a conversation and when you're talking to someone who just wants to get a rise out of you. And I think that if you're able to identify when there's a potential productive conversation that could be productive for you and or the other person, um, trying to take it to DM, or if you feel safe doing that, if it's someone that and you maintain that relationship, trying to have the conversation just in a less, just there's just something about the fact that so many people are like watching, quote unquote, that makes like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram feels it's so much more high stakes, and it's so much harder to access empathy when you are in like fight or flight mode. So
Yeah.
removing that piece, unfortunately, a lot of times people are going to say, they're just going to call you names and say,
Right.
I'm not, or just like I have a cousin who I've tried that with and he just doesn't talk to me anymore. So like,
Yeah. I
you
mean,
know,
I think Christopher says, I go to the person's character. Nobody wants to be associated with bad behavior or character flaws. And I think, to the point where you're actually interacting with a person and not a bot, and, not somebody who has somehow been lured into the anonymity of troll behavior, then you may have some success with that. What is your thinking there?
yeah, but that makes sense to me. My only concern is that people get very, and this isn't a critique. This is how our brains work. If you feel like someone is judging your morals or your identity, that's what heightens that fight or flight response and raises your blood pressure and makes you less reasonable and less
Yeah.
sympathetic. So if there's a way of engaging someone on that level without like accusing them of things, but again, it depends on the person. And that's where I go back to, you have to know yourself and what you're comfortable with and what your boundaries are. And remember that not everyone has the same boundaries. I think if more people were able to come at social media with that, we would have less of the issue that we have. But
Yeah.
again, it's a tall order.
It's really hard. And so the follow-up, another question, what are your thoughts on cancel culture and purity tests? And it does seem like we sort of danced around that a little bit, or touched on it a little bit, but it's in your book. You talk about, and it was again, Dylan, I think, was talking about this, right? The idea, I have the quote here: it can feel weird to be empathizing with someone you profoundly disagree with, especially in an age when people say you're just as bad as them if you empathize with them. And I
Mm-hmm.
thought that was a really profound observation on his part. And we do have that problem where, we're trying to, on one hand, I think that we imagine that if we did the right things or said the right things, that we could reach across and influence people who don't agree with us. And yet, on the other hand, we do kind of have this sort of purity standard and a desire not to be seen to be weak or to be giving ground to people who disagree. And
Mm-hmm.
so, I wonder if we have any kind of tools coming out of what you've learned and what you've seen in the research that give us, kind of the necessary steps to be able to communicate with people and engage at the level we're comfortable with, and in a way that's going to be as productive as we can make it, and also disengage when we need to.
This is a really great question. I think that right now, most of the um, solutions around this are more band-aid things, like Twitter making it easier for you to control who replies to you, or for a long time there have been things where if you're getting like a ton of responses, there are bots that can just make them all go away. But I actually think that there's a lot going on here at the same time. I think in general, I don't like the phrase cancel culture, because I think it's kind of been used to lump a bunch of different things together and say that they suck, which I don't think is fair. I think you're right that, again, we have a duality where we're social media, in addition to helping people connect with one another, has given a lot of people a platform who would not other platform. So a lot of people of color, a lot of women, younger people, people with disabilities, all kinds of people who we normally wouldn't, survivors of sexual assault, just people who can take this platform and they're on the same level as like a New York Times journalist and say things. And I think that's really important. And that's part of what's led to a lot of the reckoning we've had where people have gotten, quote unquote, canceled. But I think, as you mentioned, there is also a concern where it becomes a performative thing where people say, oh, who do we hate today? How can I torture them? And that is, I think, the piece that, again, like it's such a personal thing. It's such a like, tell everyone like, can you examine why you feel the need to do this? But barring that, I think that some of the little tools that the platforms are creating that are kind of band-aids are helpful. I don't really know. Like, I think the only way you stop that is by removing the reward for doing it, right? So that's why I think, in some like Instagram, there was a test where you could delete or not allow comments. And I think you can do that. You can say no comments. But another thing is these moderation tools that are being created, and they're a little controversial because, it's AI. As I talk about in the book, and I've seen you talk about too, I think, AI knows what we teach it. And so if we teach it bias, it learns bias. But there are some AI tools, including the one that we were talking about, that recognizes the different rhetorical tools or moves that are being created to monitor conversations and kind of nudge you and say, like, are you sure you want to do this? So I know Nextdoor has this. Twitter, I think, started rolling it out a little bit. But these are private companies who don't really have that much at stake with this, and they're not going to. So people, I saw when it got rolled out a little bit on Twitter, people were getting things that were like, are you sure you want to say this? And they just screenshot that and tweet it and are like, LOL, Twitter is asking. Yeah, I'm going to say it twice.
Yeah.
I'm going to say it twice now. I'm going to say it 15 times. So I don't know.
Yeah,
I haven't figured it out.
You're making a really good point in what you're presenting that I think needs to be spelled out even more, which is it's important that we ambiguate between mere differences of opinion that can actually make us better people by understanding each other's perspective and make us more well-rounded and better able to appreciate different life experiences and what we each bring to the interactions that we have. And that's assuming good faith, though. That's assuming that people are coming to interact with each other and meet on common ground with the intention of understanding one another. And that, of course, is not, it's an idealist situation that doesn't happen all that often because we have that army of trolls and bots and bad actors who are acting anonymously. And it's really hard sometimes to ambiguate between those two or distinguish between them. So that's a level of sophistication that's kind of on us as users of these platforms, because the platforms haven't done a sophisticated enough job of disambiguating those accounts.
And I don't know if they can. I mean, if we've been, especially as women, if we've been now conditioned that anytime, we put something out on the internet, it's likely a man is going to say to us. I mean, now you're on alert for that. Right. And if you've been trolled a lot, you're on alert for that. And we can't just tell people who've been, significantly harmed in some cases, like having their houses swatted, having to move just for tweeting, that, you should just try to, assume good faith in everything. Right. And so we kind of, but I think that's a good point that there is a piece of this that there is a personal responsibility piece of this because the tech just doesn't do that. And I don't know if we want it to.
Yeah, I'm not sure we want it to. I think that is a level of sophistication that we ought to equip ourselves with, more and more. It is the ability to recognize good faith from bad faith, to the extent that we can, and to the extent that it's a dichotomy such as that.
And the ability to say, do I feel capable of reading 10,000 other people's thoughts today, process healthily? And if not, can I convince myself that I don't need to do that, because I think we've all just convinced ourselves that you have to check Twitter 15 times. You have to scroll on Instagram for 15 minutes. And it's like, I mean, you don't have to. Like, if
you're blowing my mind here.
Hey, this is, I'm talking about myself. Like, I have struggle. I have the time limit thing. I very often will say ignore, and keep going. So,
yeah, that's
but
good.
I think if we think about, I think just thinking about that more.
Yeah.
Is a step in the right direction.
Sure. And so I think with our last few minutes here, it would be helpful to circle around to that topic of how do we increase our empathy? Because you did actually have some studies and some examples that you cited that can actually help us. I feel like this is a topic that's evergreen. When I speak at companies on digital transformation and when I talk to corporate leaders, and design teams and so on, so often one of the questions that comes back is, we understand it's important to empathize with people, but what if you just aren't very good at it? Like, how do we actually develop that muscle, as you mentioned earlier? And I think, too, as a team, how do people build empathy as a team? So do you have some specific guidelines or suggestions that came from the research?
One thing that has actually been researched that has nothing to do with technology actually is just reading fiction. This has been shown, especially in kids, that, if you think about it, it makes sense. You're literally putting yourself in the shoes of a character that's life is probably really different from yours, and learning how to process the emotions of someone who isn't you, and learning to do counterfactual thinking, which is something I learned from the amazing Jane McGonigal, who I'm sure you know, where you're kind of imagining something that's never happened but is possible, and like how your body and brain might react to that. That is huge. I just reading.
That's amazing. That's a thing, that just reading literary fiction can actually increase your empathy.
And it doesn't take that much effort, and it's fun.
Right. So, absolutely.
But as a team thing, I think is a really interesting point, because especially, this summer with there being, so much unrest related to the death of George Floyd and Black Lives Matter and police brutality, there's this rush to remember diversity and inclusion initiatives. Let's do those again. And I think there's a lot of pros and cons to those things that I won't go into and I'm not an expert on, but I think trying to have a meeting or a workshop about building empathy just kind of out of the blue, I don't think is going to be effective. I think if people don't trust each other, like we mentioned before, people don't feel safe, if they don't feel like they know each other, it's not going to be effective. And I think a lot of times when businesses are talking about empathy, they're talking about how can we have more empathy for our customers? And like, there are frankly just things that don't make business sense that make empathy sense, So I don't know, that's really hard, but I think just basic things like exposing yourself to more ideas and people that are different from you, following people on social media who are different from you, not to hate them and not to, make yourself angry, but to just kind of absorb and not respond. Like, just remembering you don't always have to respond. You can take a breath. A lot of this is kind of like cognitive behavioral therapy stuff. And Celeste Headley, she just has a new book out, but she had a book out a few years ago called We Need to Talk. And I mentioned that in the book. And there's amazing tips in there for just like conversational tools or moves that really work to show empathy. But the question about, as a group, building empathy as a group, that's something I'll have to think about more, because that's really interesting.
Great. I hope you do. And I hope you're able to publish some work on it, because I think it is a needed area. I mean, obviously, you alluded earlier to the notion that technology shouldn't be built and tools shouldn't be built for a population that don't include that population. So certainly that's one of the answers. This is why we need diversity and inclusion, is because we need to be able to address holistically and meaningfully like what the lived experiences of a diverse group of people are.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it is that I'm sitting here trying to think about like something really intellectually rigorous, but maybe the answer is literally just like, oh, if everyone in your development suite looks the same, like that might be a place to start.
It's certainly a good place to start. One of the other little tidbits that I thought was so interesting was that you had a study that you cited that said that we actually empathize better to things that we hear as opposed to what we read. Mm-hmm. That's so fascinating.
This is part of why I am a huge proponent of podcasts, and it's why I talked about Dylan Marin's podcast so much. And there's a few other podcasts I listen to where people, like, if I was reading what this person was saying, I might be like, ugh, roll my eyes. I'm not interested or not finish it. But it's such a passive way to consume things, but there's no way to immediately have a knee-jerk response. So I found myself listening to like hour-and-a-half long interviews with people whose beliefs I kind of despise, but I want to understand in a way that doesn't like raise my blood pressure or make me feel like I need to respond in the same way that social media does. And yeah, there was research that showed that people who only could hear each other and couldn't also see her scored higher on empathy in conversations with one another.
So interesting.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely need more research in that area. But yeah, that's why I'm a big podcast person.
I love it. I love that answer. And so one last quick thought before we wrap up and get the information on where people can find you and your work. I noticed you say on Twitter that you're pregnant. Is that right?
Yes.
Congratulations.
I am.
That's
Thank
amazing.
You.
Have you given any thought yet to what you're going to be doing as your child grows as far as tech exposure and limitation and things like that?
It is so crazy. I'm not due until January, and it's amazing the number of things I already need to apparently have figured out. But I've thought about this a little bit. I am reading a bit about some of the new research on screen and how people are really more concerned, or the experts are now saying parents should be more concerned with what kids are doing on screens than how much time they spend doing it, which I find really interesting. And so I guess my thought is that I'm not a like cut XYZ out of your life kind of person. I find that doesn't work for me and for a lot of people. So, I'm not going to give my 1-year-old an iPad probably, but I think being involved in that exposure is really something I'm going to try to do. I loved this thing that I read recently from a researcher whose name escapes me at the moment, who said that we basically need to have new dinner table conversations with our kids where instead of saying, or in addition to saying, what did you do at school today? Or, what did you learn today? But specifically, what did you learn on the internet today? Or like, what's like a funny thing you saw on the internet today? Making that kind of the new dinner table conversation so you're involved. And then you're also acknowledging that it's not always a waste of time. Like kids are looking for support on the internet. They're learning things. They're being super creative. And so I like the direction that's going. I'm trying not to worry about it too much until it comes up. But
that's good. They may even someday connect with a really brilliant author and have them on their live show. I mean, it's possible. It's possible. So, Kaitlin, thank you so much for being here with us today. How can people find you and your work? What's the best way to connect with you online?
So I am on Twitter, despite everything I just said. I am on Twitter at Kaitlin Ugolik. So it's KAITLIN UGOLIK. And I also have a website. You can actually go to thefutureoffeeling.com, which is the name of my book, or KaitlinUgolik.com, and you can there. I have a newsletter there that you can sign up for that has been kind of on hiatus during quarantine, but hopefully we'll get back up and running soon.
Sadly, not the cake newsletter, though.
No, I started a cake newsletter at the beginning of quarantine, and it was fun, but then it just became too much work. But yeah, if you want to read other things I've written, it's at my website, and there's a link to buy the book there as well if you're interested.
All right, and Christopher Dan says, thanks so much, Kaitlin. Appreciate your perspective. This was enlightening. So
Thank you.
thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Kaitlin. I'm going to go ahead and sign off with you. And I so much appreciate you being here. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. Wasn't that wonderful? It's such a fantastic subject. And I guess I feel like, again, we talk so much about empathy and we so rarely have really good tools to talk about it with. So I hope this was helpful to you. I hope you learned some things that you can share. And I hope you'll go and buy Kaitlin's book. So please do that. And please subscribe and follow everywhere. Share with friends. Spread the word. And we're going to come back next week with another great guest. And I look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you for being here.